What if the most devastating bomb dropped on Iran this year was never meant to sink a single ship? I'm Ryan, a former F-15E combat pilot, and I've spent days pulling apart everything confirmed about the strike everyone's calling the deadliest bunker buster hit of this war, and the real story is stranger than the headline. Stick with me, because by the end I'll show you why a Hellfire missile went into a tanker's smokestack instead of its hull, why 2 Marine units are sitting off the coast doing nothing yet, and why a retired 4-star admiral said he'd be genuinely worried if Washington finally pulls the trigger on the one option nobody's talking about. I want to walk you through this sourced, step by step, because the loud version online does not match what Iran's own state media and independent reporting are actually saying, and I think you deserve the accurate one. Start with why this one island keeps swallowing every headline about this war. Kharg Island sits 16 to 20 miles off Iran's Gulf Coast, smaller than a third of Manhattan, and it moves roughly 90% of every barrel of crude Iran exports, close to 950 million barrels a year, according to reporting I've cross-checked from multiple outlets. Oil from the Abazar, Firuzan, and Deruza fields gets piped underwater to the island, loaded onto tankers, and shipped out, with China buying more than 11% of its entire seaborne crude through that one facility. American officials have called Kharg the nexus of Iran's whole oil supply chain, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. I think it's accurate. There's even a declassified CIA document from 1984 that called this island the most vital facility in Iran's entire oil system, so this isn't a fresh discovery. American intelligence has known this was Iran's economic jugular for over 4 decades. Here's the detail that genuinely stopped me when I found it. Back in 1988, decades before he ever ran for office, Donald Trump told The Guardian that if one bullet was ever fired at an American ship, he'd go in and take Kharg Island himself. That's not a talking point invented for this war. That's something apparently sitting in his head since the Reagan years, and I think it explains a lot about why this island specifically keeps coming up every single time he addresses this conflict. Now, the actual timeline, and I want to go slow here because the details matter more than the noise. On March 13th, American forces hit Kharg with what Central Command described as a large-scale precision strike. More than 90 separate military targets destroyed in a single night. Naval mine storage, missile bunkers, air defense systems, a naval base, an airport control tower, a helicopter hangar. Iranian officials said they heard more than 15 explosions, and one oil ministry official called the strike enormous, describing nearly 2 straight hours of bombardment that shook the island. 2 hours. That's an extraordinarily long strike package for a piece of land this small. And it tells you the tonnage delivered that night was massive, heavy enough that some analysts believe bunker-penetrating munitions were involved given the depth of the underground storage targeted. But here's what almost nobody mentions when they scream that Kharg got erased. Not one piece of oil infrastructure was hit. Central Command's own statement said so explicitly the operation destroyed military sites while deliberately preserving the export terminal, and Iran's own damage assessment confirmed it. No oil company employees hurt, no casualties among residents, all sectors continuing routine activity. Trump posted that the strikes had totally obliterated the island's military capability, then said he was sparing the oil for what he called reasons of decency, and satellite images taken days later showed 3 tankers still moored at the terminal, loading cargo like nothing catastrophic had touched the export side at all. A White House official told the BBC around this same time that the American military could take out Kharg at any moment it chose, adding that Trump retained every option as commander-in-chief, even though there were no current plans to send troops in. Then in early April, American forces struck again, hitting roughly 50 of the same target sets from March. And Vice President Vance said publicly this was not a change in strategy, just enforcement of a deadline Trump had set for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Once more, the oil terminal was left alone, and Iran's own Mehr news agency admitted the maritime infrastructure suffered little damage and kept operating normally. Then again in July, tied to Iran's ongoing attacks on shipping through the strait, Trump told reporters he'd ordered forces to knock out a piece of the island, but said, quote, "Don't touch the oil," and confirmed that order had been followed to the letter. So across 4 months and at least 3 separate strike waves, the pattern never wavered once. Hit the military side as hard as physically possible, and leave the economic engine standing every single time, like a dial that gets turned all the way up and then deliberately held there instead of pushed past the line. This was never mercy. Destroying that terminal outright would be economic self-harm on a global scale, because Kharg's oil moves through the entire world market, and Brent crude already jumped more than 5% in a single day just off Trump's verbal threats about the island, according to reporting from Al Jazeera. Actually flattening the terminal would send that number far higher. hitting Chinese refineries and gas pumps here at home simultaneously, which is exactly the kind of self-inflicted wound that makes any president think twice, no matter how satisfying the rhetoric sounds in the moment. So the real strategy has been to prove, over and over, that Washington absolutely can hit Kharg whenever it wants, while holding the actual killing blow in reserve as leverage rather than spending it. Now let's talk about the seizure option, because this is the part of the story that I think deserves way more attention than it's getting. According to CNN reporting, citing people familiar with intelligence assessments and active military planning, the administration has genuinely weighed sending troops to physically seize Kharg outright, using it as leverage to force Iran back to the table on Hormuz for good. 2 Marine expeditionary units built for rapid amphibious raids have already deployed to the region, alongside roughly 1,000 soldiers from the Army's 82nd Airborne. Retired Vice Admiral Robert Harward told Fox News the Marines could likely take the island in a matter of hours given how small and lightly garrisoned it is, calling it one of many ways to skin this particular cat. But here's the open loop I promised you at the top. Taking the island, according to every serious voice in this reporting, is reportedly the easy part. Holding it is a completely different problem. Kharg sits well within range of Iranian shore-based missiles, drones, and anti-ship weapons. And Iran has spent recent weeks preparing for exactly this scenario, laying traps and moving additional personnel, air defenses, and shoulder-fired systems onto the island itself. Retired Admiral James Stavridis, the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, said bluntly he'd be very worried about an operation like this, because in his own words, Iranians are clever and ruthless. And one Israeli intelligence source raised a possibility that genuinely gave me chills when I read it, that if American forces did seize and hold the island, Iran's most rational move wouldn't be trying to retake it, it would be firing on the oil infrastructure itself, since at that point there'd be nothing left to lose, and doing so would inflict maximum economic pain on the exact asset America was trying to protect. That source admitted there's no way to know in advance whether Iran would actually take that risk. Gulf allies have reportedly been privately urging Washington against this move, worried about Iranian retaliation against their own infrastructure, and pushing instead for dismantling Iran's ballistic missile program before any final resolution. Now, my own honest read, and I'll flag clearly this next part, is analysis, not reported fact. An amphibious seizure of a small island is genuinely one of the more straightforward things a modern expeditionary force can pull off quickly, tracking with historical parallels going back to island landings in the Pacific during World War II, where the initial assault was often the cheapest part of the whole operation. The real vulnerability isn't the landing, it's the weeks after, defending exposed terrain against an adversary that knows every inch of that ground. That sustainment phase is where small garrisons have historically bled the most, and I think that risk is exactly what's holding this decision back right now. There's also a genuinely unresolved thread worth mentioning. Satellite imagery from the Copernicus Sentinel program picked up a gray and white slick stretching roughly 45 kilometers just west of the island in early May, assessed by independent researchers as consistent with an oil spill and possibly the largest environmental incident of the war so far. Iranian officials denied any connection to military activity, blaming waste from a European tanker instead, and I haven't seen anything that definitively settles that dispute either way. I want to walk you through one more piece before I give you my prediction, because I think it's the clearest window into how this entire blockade is actually being enforced day to day. After Trump reimposed the naval blockade on Iranian ports, Central Command disabled an unladen tanker, the Curaçao-flagged M/T Belma, after it allegedly tried running toward Kharg in defiance of repeated warnings. A U.S. aircraft fired Hellfire missiles into the ship's smokestack, disabling propulsion without sinking the vessel or causing crew casualties, and Central Command said afterward the ship was no longer transiting toward Iran. That's a remarkably surgical way to enforce a blockade, targeting a ship's ability to move rather than destroying it outright, and I think it's the clearest parallel to the entire Kharg strategy itself, hit hard enough to make the point, without crossing into destruction that creates a humanitarian disaster nobody wants attached to their name. So here's where I think this actually goes. I believe Kharg keeps functioning exactly as it already has, a pressure point that gets hit hard every time Iran escalates elsewhere, short of full destruction or an actual ground seizure, unless something specific breaks that calculus, a direct American casualty tied to the island, a sudden spike in Iranian lethality against Gulf partners, or oil prices climbing high enough that Washington starts hunting for a way to shock the market back down fast. If any one of those happens, I'd expect the political pressure inside Washington to blow past the current restraint faster than most people expect. And underneath every strike statistic and troop number, there are real people showing up to that island right now. Dock workers loading crude, maintenance crews checking pipeline pressure, families on the mainland depending on that revenue for electricity and hospitals, glancing at the sky every time an unfamiliar aircraft passes overhead, wondering if today is the day the restraint finally runs out. That's the part I don't think gets nearly enough attention. So tell me, does Washington actually go through with a ground seizure of Kharg Island? Or does this hit hard, spare the oil pattern, just keep repeating for months? Drop that answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this breakdown gave you the real picture instead of the exaggerated one, subscribe. Because the moment this restraint finally breaks, I'll be the one breaking down exactly what happened next.